The sun rose over the small village of Nko, casting a golden glow over the red clay roofs and the towering steeple of the Holy Redeemer Church. It was Sunday morning, and the air was filled with the sound of hymns and the rhythmic beat of drums. Among the congregation, one face stood out: Ada, a 19-year-old girl with a radiant smile and a heart full of devotion. She was the pride of the church, known for her kindness, her angelic voice in the choir, and her unwavering faith. Ada had grown up in the church, raised by her grandmother after her parents passed away when she was just a child. The church was her sanctuary, a place where she found solace and purpose. Every Sunday, she arrived early to arrange the pews, polish the altar, and prepare the hymnals. The members of the congregation adored her, often calling her the light of the church. Pastor Emmanuel, the charismatic leader of Holy Redeemer, was a man of great influence. His sermons were powerful, filled with fiery declarations of faith and promises of divine blessings. The villagers hung on his every word, believing him to be a true man of God. Ada, too, admired him deeply. He had been a father figure to her, offering guidance and support when she needed it most. Over the years, their bond had grown strong, and Ada trusted him implicitly. But lately, something had changed. Ada's once bright smile had dimmed, and her laughter had become rare. During choir practice, she would sometimes drift off, her voice faltering as if her mind were elsewhere. The other choir members noticed but dismissed it as fatigue. Ada works too hard, they would say. She needs to rest. One Sunday, as the congregation gathered for service, Ada stood at the back of the church, her hands trembling as she clutched her Bible. She scanned the room, her eyes lingering on Pastor Emmanuel as he prepared to deliver his sermon. Her heart raced, and a wave of nausea washed over her. She forced herself to breathe, to focus on the familiar surroundings that had always brought her comfort. The service began, and Ada joined the choir on the raised platform. As they sang, her voice wavered, and she struggled to keep up with the others. Pastor Emmanuel glanced at her, his expression a mix of concern and something else, something Ada couldn't quite place. She looked away, her chest tightening with a mixture of fear and anger. After the service, the congregation gathered outside to socialize. Ada tried to slip away unnoticed, but Pastor Emmanuel called out to her. "Ada, my child, come here," he said, his voice warm and inviting. She hesitated, then forced herself to walk toward him. "Is everything all right, Ada?" he asked, placing a hand on her shoulder. His touch sent a shiver down her spine, and she fought the urge to pull away. "I'm fine, Pastor," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just tired." He studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers. "You know you can always talk to me, don't you?" "I'm here for you, Ada." She nodded, forcing a smile. "Thank you, Pastor." As she walked home that evening, Ada's mind raced with thoughts she couldn't escape. Memories of that night flooded her mind, the night Pastor Emmanuel had called her to his office after choir practice. He had said he needed to discuss something important, something private. She had gone willingly, trusting him as she always had. But what happened next had shattered her world. She had tried to forget, to bury the pain deep inside. But the secret she carried was like a weight pressing down on her chest, growing heavier with each passing day. She had confided in no one, not even her grandmother. How could she? Who would believe her? Pastor Emmanuel was a man of God, revered by the entire community. And she was just a girl who had once trusted too easily. As Ada reached her small home at the edge of the village, she paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. Inside, her grandmother was waiting, humming a hymn as she prepared dinner. Ada plastered on a smile and stepped inside, determined to keep up the facade. But as she sat at the table, picking at her food, her grandmother noticed the change in her. "Ada, my child, what's troubling you?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. Nothing, Grandma, Ada replied, avoiding her gaze. I'm just tired. Her grandmother studied her for a moment, then reached across the table to take her hand. You know you can tell me anything, don't you? I'm here for you, always. Ada nodded, her throat tightening with unshed tears. She wanted to tell her grandmother everything, to unburden herself of the secret that was eating her alive. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she forced another smile and said, I know, Grandma. Thank you. That night, as Ada lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she made a decision. She couldn't keep living like this, carrying the weight of her secret alone. Something had to change. But what? And how? As the moonlight filtered through the window, casting shadows on the walls, Ada's mind began to race with possibilities. A plan began to form, one that would expose the truth and make those who had wronged her pay. But it was a dangerous plan, one that could destroy everything she held dear. And yet, as she closed her eyes and drifted into a restless sleep, Ada knew she had no other choice. The time for silence was over. The rain poured heavily that night, drumming against the tin roof of the church as Ada sat alone in the choir room, waiting. Pastor Emmanuel had asked her to stay behind after practice, saying he needed to discuss something important. She didn't mind, she trusted him completely. He had always been kind to her, like a father guiding his daughter. When the last choir member left, the church grew quiet except for the sound of the rain. Ada hummed softly to herself, flipping through the pages of her hymnal. The door creaked open, and Pastor Emmanuel walked in, his face solemn but warm. Ada, my child, he said, closing the door behind him. Thank you for staying. I wanted to speak with you about something delicate. Ada nodded, her curiosity piqued. Of course, Pastor. What is it? He sat down beside her, his expression softening. You've been such a blessing to this church, Ada. Your voice, your dedication, it's truly inspiring. But I've noticed something troubling lately. You seem distant. Is everything all right? Ada hesitated. She hadn't realized her struggles were so visible. I'm fine, Pastor. Just tired, I guess. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. You know you can trust me, don't you? Whatever it is, I'm here to help. His words were comforting, and for a moment, Ada felt a surge of relief. Maybe she could confide in him. But before she could speak, his hand moved to her cheek, his thumb brushing against her skin. She froze, her heart pounding as his face drew closer. Ada, he whispered, his voice low and unfamiliar. You're so special to me. So pure. So beautiful. Panic surged through her as she realized what was happening. Pastor, please. But he cut her off, his grip tightening. My child. Trust me. This is God's will. The next few minutes were a blur. Ada's protests were drowned out by the sound of the rain and the weight of his authority. She felt powerless, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. When it was over, he stood up, adjusting his robe as if nothing had happened. Remember, Ada, he said, his voice calm and steady. This stays between us. It's our secret. God is watching. She sat there, trembling, as he walked out of the room, leaving her alone in the darkness. The rain continued to fall, but it felt distant now, like the world had shifted and left her behind. Weeks passed, and Ada's life became a shadow of what it once was. She avoided the church as much as she could, making excuses to skip choir practice and Sunday services. Her grandmother noticed the change but assumed it was just a phase. Then came the fever. It started as a mild ache, but soon Ada was bedridden, her body racked with chills and fatigue. Her grandmother took her to the clinic, where the doctor ran tests. When the results came back, Ada's world shattered all over again. HIV. The word echoed in her mind as she sat in the small clinic room, staring at the floor. How could this happen? She had been careful, faithful, pure. And yet, here she was, carrying a disease that would mark her for life. The shame was overwhelming. She couldn't tell anyone, not even her grandmother. How could she explain something she barely understood herself? And who would believe her if she accused Pastor Emmanuel? He was a man of God, respected and revered. She was just a girl. As the days turned into weeks, Ada's anger grew. She began to question everything she had ever believed in. How could a man who preached about God's love do something so vile? How could the church, her sanctuary, harbor such hypocrisy? One night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Ada made a decision. She couldn't let this go. She couldn't let him win. The church had failed her, but she wouldn't fail herself. The plan began to form in her mind, dark and dangerous. If the church wouldn't hold him accountable, she would. And she would make sure no one else suffered as she had. Ada sat by the window of her small room, staring out at the church steeple silhouetted against the evening sky. The anger inside her had grown into a burning fire, consuming every thought. She couldn't let Pastor Emmanuel's betrayal go unpunished. The church had failed her, and now she would make sure they all felt the weight of her pain. Her plan was simple but dangerous. If the pastor could hide behind his pulpit and his lies, she would strike from the shadows. She would use the very thing he had given her, the virus, as a weapon. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about exposing the hypocrisy of the church, the men who preached morality but lived in sin. Ada began by targeting the men who had always looked at her with a little too much interest. The deacon who always lingered after services, the choir director who complimented her voice a little too often, the usher who offered to walk her home. She knew how to play the part, how to smile and flirt just enough to draw them in. The first was Brother Chaik, a married man with 3 children. He had always been kind to her, but Ada saw the way his eyes lingered when he thought no one was watching. One evening, after choir practice, she approached him, her voice soft and hesitant. "Brother, can I talk to you for a moment?" she asked, her eyes downcast. "Of course, Ada," he replied, his tone warm but cautious. "I've been feeling so alone lately," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know who else to turn to." He hesitated, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "What's wrong, my child?" She stepped closer, her hand brushing against his. "I just need someone to listen. Someone, like you." It didn't take much. Within weeks, Brother Chaik was just the first of many. Ada moved through the church like a shadow, her actions calculated and precise. Each man thought he was special, chosen by her for his kindness or charm. None of them suspected the truth. As the months passed, the community began to notice a pattern. Men who had once been healthy and strong were now falling ill, their bodies weakened by a mysterious sickness. Whispers spread through the village, but no one could explain what was happening. Pastor Emmanuel addressed the congregation one Sunday, his voice filled with concern. "Brothers and sisters, we must pray for those among us who are suffering. The devil is at work, but God is greater. We must remain faithful and trust in his healing power." Ada sat in the back, her face a mask of calm. She watched as the pastor spoke, his words ringing hollow in her ears. He had no idea what was coming, no idea that his sins were about to catch up with him. The plan was working, but Ada felt no satisfaction. Each encounter left her feeling emptier, more isolated. She had become the very thing she despised, a predator, using others to achieve her goals. But she couldn't stop now. She had gone too far to turn back. As the illness spread, the community grew more desperate. They turned to prayers, to traditional healers, to anything that might offer answers. But Ada knew the truth. And soon, so would they. The air in the church was thick with tension as Ada stood in the corner, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The Sunday service had just ended, and the congregation was milling about, their voices low and anxious. The mysterious illness had spread further, and fear was beginning to take root in the community. Brother Chike, once a robust and cheerful man, now looked frail and gaunt. He approached Ada, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and desperation. "Ada," he said, his voice trembling, "we need to talk. Now." She hesitated, her heart pounding, but nodded and followed him to a quiet corner of the churchyard. The moment they were alone, he turned on her, his face contorted with rage. "What did you do to me?" he demanded, his voice rising. "I've been to the clinic, Ada. They told me I have HIV. And I know it was you." Ada's stomach churned, but she kept her expression calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice steady. "Don't lie to me," he shouted, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. "You're the only one I've been with outside my marriage. You did this to me." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and damning. Ada's mask of composure began to crack. "You think this is my fault?" she shot back, her voice shaking with anger. "You think I wanted this? You men, you're all the same. You take what you want and leave the rest of us to suffer." Her words echoed across the churchyard, and a small crowd began to gather. Brother Chike's wife pushed her way to the front, her face pale with shock. "What is going on here?" she demanded. Ada turned to her, tears streaming down her face. "Ask your husband. Ask him why he's sick. And while you're at it, ask Pastor Emmanuel what he did to me." The crowd gasped, their murmurs growing louder. Pastor Emmanuel, who had been watching from a distance, stepped forward, his face a mask of concern. "Ada, my child, what are you saying? This is not the time for such accusations. Don't call me your child." Ada screamed, her voice breaking. "You're no man of God. You're a monster. You did this to me, and now everyone is paying for your sins." The churchyard erupted into chaos. Some members rushed to defend the pastor, while others turned to Ada, demanding answers. Sister Neka collapsed into tears, and Brother Chike stood frozen, his face a mixture of guilt and horror. As the truth began to sink in, the community was torn apart. Ada was ostracized, branded as a troublemaker and a sinner. But not everyone turned against her. A few women, including her grandmother, began to question the blind trust they had placed in Pastor Emmanuel. "Maybe she's telling the truth," one woman whispered. "Why would she lie about something like this?" The pastor tried to regain control, his voice booming over the crowd. "This is the work of the devil. Do not let him divide us." But the damage was done. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and the once unshakable faith of the congregation was beginning to crumble. Ada stood in the center of the storm, her body trembling but her resolve unbroken. She had exposed the truth, but the battle was far from over. The following Sunday, the Holy Redeemer Church was packed to capacity. Word of Ada's accusations had spread like wildfire, and the entire village had come to hear the truth. Ada stood at the front of the church, her grandmother by her side, facing Pastor Emmanuel as he prepared to deliver his sermon. The pastor began as he always did, with a prayer and a call for unity. But before he could continue, Ada stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "Pastor Emmanuel," she said, her tone firm and unwavering, "you can't hide behind your pulpit anymore. The truth is out, and it's time you answered for what you've done." The congregation gasped, their eyes darting between Ada and the pastor. He tried to speak, but Ada didn't give him the chance. "You abused your power," she continued, her voice rising. "You took advantage of me, and you infected me with HIV. And instead of taking responsibility, you hid behind your title and your lies. But I won't stay silent anymore. I won't let you hurt anyone else. The church erupted into chaos. Some members shouted in support of Ada, while others defended the pastor, their voices clashing in a cacophony of anger and disbelief. But Ada stood her ground, her eyes locked on Pastor Emmanuel. Finally, the pastor raised his hands, calling for silence. When the room quieted, he stepped down from the pulpit, his face pale and drawn. "Ada," he said, his voice trembling, I don't know what to say. If I have wronged you, I am deeply sorry." His apology was met with mixed reactions. Some members nodded, willing to forgive, while others shook their heads in disgust. Ada's grandmother stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about Ada," she said. "It's about all of us. We trusted you, Pastor, and you betrayed that trust. But this is also a chance for us to do better. To protect our children, to hold those in power accountable, and to break the silence that allows abuse to thrive." Her words resonated with the congregation. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Women who had once stayed silent about their own experiences of abuse began to speak up, their voices joining Ada's in a chorus of truth and courage. In the weeks that followed, the community came together to address the systemic issues that had allowed such abuse to go unchecked. Pastor Emmanuel stepped down from his position, and the church implemented new safeguards to protect its members. Ada, though scarred by her experiences, found a new purpose. She became an advocate for HIV awareness, sharing her story to educate others and break the stigma surrounding the disease. She also worked with local organizations to support survivors of abuse, helping them find their voices and reclaim their lives. One evening, as she stood outside the church, Ada felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. She had found healing through forgiveness, not just for Pastor Emmanuel, but for herself. The road ahead was long, but Ada knew she wasn't alone. She had her grandmother, her community, and a newfound strength that would carry her forward. Together, they would build a future where no one had to suffer in silence.